The most frequently asked question that I receive on this channel is, what does it cost to live in remote Alaska? Well, grab your pen and paper because today I'm going to break down all the costs here at my cabin and things that you might incur if you decide to make this move, and even some hidden costs you might not have considered. If you're planning a move to Alaska, or you're just toying around with the idea, you yourself are probably trying to figure out exactly how much money are you going to need to spend in order to live comfortably. Well, today I want to talk to you about the cost of buying land, whether that's raw land that you're going to then have to put in some infrastructure in order to make that land livable, or you're buying a piece of property that already has a home or a cabin built on it. What costs are going to be necessary to get that home up and running, and also the cost to maintain that home and a comfortable lifestyle. Plus, as I mentioned, there are some hidden costs that I don't think a lot of people take into consideration. So today I'll cover all of those topics and more, but let's start with where I'm at so you have a basis of where I'm coming from. I moved up to Alaska the end of the summer of 2021. At that point, I had just bought my cabin and the land upon which it sits. I get a lot of questions about how much land do I actually have. I like to joke that I have 15 million and 5 acres. 15 million because my property backs up to the Wrangell St. Elias National Park, and then I personally have 5 acres that backs directly up to the national park and preserves. Now, I have a rather large cabin here as well. Most of the remote properties that you'll find on the market generally are not this big. My home is just under 3,000 square feet when everything is taken into consideration. Plus, when I bought my property, there were multiple outbuildings on the property as well. I have a bunkhouse that I can use as an emergency shelter or a guest home for visitors. I also had a greenhouse on the property and another small building. Both the greenhouse and the other small building have been demolished because they were not safe. Regardless, I bought my property just over 2.5 years ago. At that time, this cabin had sat empty for a number of years, and it is also in an area of Alaska that hadn't seen a whole lot of growth for quite some time. In fact, this area of Alaska was shrinking in population. Over the course of the last couple of years, the cost of goods and materials has continued to increase in price, and land has become more and more expensive. So I want to go over some comparative properties with you so that you have an idea of what today's market looks like. I'm not going to talk about what it cost me to buy my property because, as I mentioned, the cost at that time was different than it is today. So let's look at today's market and let's talk about some of the things that go into buying property here in Alaska. At the time of filming this video, it is February 2024, and I was able to find a property on Zillow that is a 1-bedroom, 1-bath, 1,400 square feet for $90,000 located in Delta Junction. This property is actually located outside of the town, and it does sit on 5 acres. So it's similar to my cabin in the fact that it sits on the same size property, it's outside of the town, and that it needs work. My property needed a new roof, and by looking at this one, I would say that it also needs a new roof put on it. So you're going to have some cost that way, that you're going to have to make some repairs to a cabin similar as this. And finding someone to do the work is not easy. So unless you yourself are qualified, skilled enough to be able to put a roof on a building of this size, this property might not be something that suits you. This property also has an outbuilding on it. However, this one just happens to be a garage. My property doesn't have a garage, but I'm trying to show you something that is comparative in size as my property is, so you get a general idea of what today's market value looks like. This property also has electric and septic, which my property had, but it also has a water well, which mine does not, so I don't have access to water. So having those things will save you some money right there. But what this property has that mine didn't is a lot of debris and personal possessions that have been left behind by the previous owner. This is pretty common in remote properties in Alaska, especially if they're ones that are not on the road system. because it generally took years for the previous owner to accumulate all these items. And when they leave, they either leave in a hurry or they may have deceased, and therefore those items are just left behind. And now it's your issue to clean up the property. I know someone who bought property recently in the state of Alaska, and they had a 20-foot U-Haul full of items that had been left behind, basically trash, and it cost them over $700 to dispose of those items at the local dump. So keep that in mind, because even if it's repairs that you're making, the leftover construction material or things like that are also a cost that you need to take into consideration when buying remote property. As I stated, the reason for showing you that particular property is to give you a basic visual representation of something that is similar to the property that I'm in. However, that is just one property. When it comes to looking at cabins here in Alaska, you can find just about anything in the market today. Everything from a small trapper's cabin up to a multi-million-dollar lodge is available. It's just a matter of what you're willing to spend. But when it comes to how you're willing to spend your money, there are some things that you need to take into consideration with property that has an existing building on it, especially when looking at remote properties in Alaska. A lot of the remote properties don't have any building codes associated with them. Because of that, a lot of times you'll find those cabins in a state of not being finished, shall we say. Either they don't have traditional floors in them, such as my cabin. I only have plywood floors in here. A lot of cabins are just finished in OSB, so they don't have traditional siding on them. There's a lot of dry cabins in Alaska as well, so they might not have plumbing in their cabins, such as I don't. Even though I had a septic, I took it out because I don't need it. I took out all the plumbing in my cabin. That's a whole nother story. You can watch the rest of my videos to figure out why I did that. But the point I'm making is that because a lot of the cabins in Alaska may not have been built with any building codes, it means that they haven't received a certificate of occupancy. And if they don't meet certain criteria, they're not going to qualify for traditional financing. Therefore, you might have to work out an agreement with the seller on financing or pay cash for that property. So those are a couple things that you want to keep in mind, because if you're working with the seller, you're going to be paying a higher interest rate than you would if you went with traditional financing. Now, you can also buy raw land and pay to have that land cleared so that you have an area to build your cabin and put in a driveway. The average cost is about $2,500 all the way up to $5,000 per acre to clear land. And depending upon where the land is that you're looking to purchase, the price on that is going to vary dramatically. Mainly dependent upon how suitable that land is for building. Is it in a municipalities such as Anchorage or the Matsu Valley, Fairbanks, something like that, where you might have property taxes and other fees that are associated with that land. Now, I'm not going to cover what it actually costs to build a cabin, but I can tell you for some of the infrastructure that you're going to need or may want to install on your property, what the general cost of that might be. So if you were to install a septic system at your property, you're looking at anywhere between $8,000 and $12,000 for a septic system. And also you need to keep in mind that septic systems are installed based upon the number of bedrooms a residence has. So typically, if you're in an area where you need to get a permit for that, you're going to pull the permit based off of whether or not you have a 2 to 3 bedroom home. And if it's permitted for such, saying a 2 to 3 bedroom home, you won't be able to build additions onto that home if you don't get a septic system that's rated for, say, a 4 or 5 or 6 bedroom home. So if you're planning on expanding, have your septic system permitted for as large of a home as you eventually plan on building, not what your current needs are necessarily, if you're in an area where you're required to pull building permits. But again, $8,000 to $12,000 for a septic system. One other thing then is if you're installing electric at your property, that you're going to be looking at basically anywhere from $7,000 to $14,000 per 300 foot of run from the main power source to your electrical box. Now, that cost also is going to vary depending upon what that main electrical source is that it's pulling from. Is that a power pole with a transformer on it? Is it a junction box out on the road? Or is it just a power pole? So depending upon also whether or not you want that power line buried underground, which is going to cost you more than having it run overhead. So again, an estimate, and these are rough estimates, would be between $7,000 and $14,000 per 300 foot of line. And you can get more information by going to the local utility company for the area in which you're planning on building. And again, remember that utilities are not available throughout all of Alaska. Depending upon where your property is located, you might not have any other options than going solar or going without electricity altogether. Now, I mentioned that I don't have water coming into my property, and that means that I haul all of my water in. I use 5-gallon jerry cans to do so, and I purchase a key that I can use annually for about $150 to $300, depending upon the amount of water that you plan on collecting each time. And then I bring my water home and I filter it through the Berkey. I'm not going to talk about the cost of a Berkey. This is something that you can look up yourself, and there's all sorts of alternatives for this. But if you're planning on installing a well on your property, that can be a risky situation because there's no guarantee that the well digger is going to hit water, what the flow rate of that water is going to be, and if that water is going to be palatable. In the area where I live, the water is not considered palatable. And also the aquifers are so far down that they may never strike water. And if they do, as I mentioned, that flow rate is going to be very minimal, if anything at all. So keep that in mind, that if you're looking to get a well put on your property, do so at your own risk and realize that they charge by the foot that they're going to have to drill. And if they don't hit water, you still got to pay that bill. So let's move on into some other costs that you might incur, though, once you've already got your property established. And that would be, how are you going to heat your home? When it comes to heating your home or cabin here in Alaska, you have a couple different options available to you. The two most common forms are firewood or heating oil. Firewood is generally either cut or purchased early in the year and stockpiled for cold days like this so that you can heat your home. If you think about cutting firewood from your own land or from the Bureau of Land Management's land, there's still a cost involved with that. There are some individuals who think that they are strictly going to cut firewood from the trees on their own property. But that might not always be possible. You might not be in an area where you're allowed to cut the trees from your land, or you might not have enough trees viable for cutting. Or if you do wind up cutting the trees on your land, that eventually you're going to wind up depleting your wood supply. So if you're not going to cut trees from your own land, you could always get a firewood cutting permit from the state of Alaska. It's usually managed by the forestry department. Those run $30 and allows you to cut up to 10 cords of firewood or board wood. Either way, you could use that wood for wood projects around your property or firewood. However, one thing to keep in mind about that is that access to that wood is extremely difficult in many areas. Again, depending upon where you're moving in Alaska, you may not actually have trees that are viable for cutting, if any trees at all. The further north you go, the less trees there are. And the other issue with that is that, again, it only gets you 10 cords of wood. So depending upon the size of cabin that you have, how well insulated it is, and how efficient your wood stove is, you might find that 10 cords is not quite enough. Now, here in my cabin, the first year that I lived here, again, my home is just under 3,000 square feet, and this wood stove is 28 years old. The first year that I lived in this cabin, I burnt through 7 to 8 cords of wood. I've since had some insulation changed, a new roof put on, window added, doors added, things like that. And I found that the next year I burnt even more wood. So I also know people that have smaller cabins than I do that have burnt upwards of 13 to 15 cords of wood a year. And yet there are others who only burn 2 cords. But it also depends upon, like I said, how big of a home you have, how efficient your wood stove is, and also, are you supplementing that heat in other ways? I'll talk about those supplemental ways in a moment, but one other thing that I want to talk about is that if you're cutting your own firewood, there is a hidden cost to that as well, and that is your time. It is going to take you time to gain access to the firewood to cut it. It's going to take you time to transport that firewood from wherever you felled the tree back to your cabin, and then to buck up that wood and split it. So there's a hidden cost there. You can get a log splitter to help aid in the process. Those generally are going to run between $500 and $1,500. But your time is valuable too. So keep that in mind if you're thinking about collecting your own firewood. One other thing is that you could purchase firewood like I have done. Now, I purchased firewood because I knew I wasn't set up to haul firewood myself at the time of moving into this cabin. And last year's prices of firewood have run between $350 to $385 per cord, and it didn't matter whether you're burning spruce or birch. And depending upon who you order your firewood from, how far away they are from your property, you might incur a delivery fee as well. When I was ordering firewood from the Matsu Valley, considering that is a few hours drive away from where I live, I faced a delivery fee of about $200 per 3 cords of wood. So if you're looking to heat up your cabin quickly, birch is my preferred firewood for that. But you can also burn spruce, as I'm doing right now, and you will get a decent heat out of it. If you're burning rounds as opposed to split logs, you're also going to get more burn time out of that wood. So everything has its own unique nuances about it. But let's talk about some of the other supplemental ways that you can heat your home. A very common method of heating homes here in Alaska is by using an oil burner. Now, you can also get a waste oil burner. I'm not going to cover that topic, but I will tell you that if you're refurbishing a cabin that doesn't have an oil burner in it, or you're building a new cabin, this is something that you might want to consider installing. A new Toyo stove, Laser 723, which is the largest stove on the market right now out of Toyo, those are going to run you about $2,500. Now, you can also buy refurbished ones, and if you have one in your home that is older, you might be able to get it refurbished and up and running into a proper state. Now, this runs off of both electricity and heating fuel, as I mentioned. If you're building your cabin and you decide to install an oil burner, you're also going to need to purchase an oil tank and a stand for it to sit on. Now, you can construct your own stand, but the tanks range in size, and you can get a 300-gallon tank for roughly $900, $1,000, or you can get a 500-gallon tank for roughly $1,300. And again, you'll need a stand to go with each one of those. This runs, like I said, also on electricity. And electricity currently, at least in this area of Alaska that I live in, is currently running 37 cents per kilowatt hour. So the amount of fuel that you're going to burn through and the amount of electricity that you're going to use to run this is just going to be dependent upon what temperature you decide to keep it running at, how frequently you run it, and things like that. I can tell you that fuel costs right now in Alaska are roughly around $5 per gallon for heating fuel. Now, you have another option too. You can install a propane heater, which you can purchase a lot cheaper than this. A propane heater is going to run you around $200 for a propane wall heater. You can purchase those even off of Amazon. And those propane wall heaters don't require electricity to run. However, propane, depending upon where you live in Alaska, can be more expensive. According to what I've been able to research, it can be as low as $2.83 a gallon, all the way up to $6 a gallon, depending upon where you live. Those are your options as far as external heat sources, propane or a Toyo stove or a waste oil burner. Now, let's talk about that electricity cost of 37 cents per kilowatt hour. Understanding energy consumption can seem confusing at times, but it's really more simple than we make it out to be. The first thing that you're going to want to do is you're going to want to understand the power usage of the appliance in question. So in my example, I'm going to use a 60-watt light bulb. It's 60 watts. That's the power usage. It uses 60 watts of energy. But I want to figure out the kilowatts. So I'm going to take 60 divided by 1,000, and that's going to give me 0.06. 0.06, then I'm going to multiply times the hours of usage in a month. In this case, let's say I use it for 90 hours. That is then going to give me 5.4 kilowatt hours of usage. Now, if I want to know what that's going to cost me, I'm going to multiply that by what the energy or what the utility company charges me per kilowatt hour, which in my case is 37 cents. At 37 cents times 5.4 kilowatt hours, my cost is $1.99.8 per month of usage for a 60-watt light bulb at 90 hours a month. Now, in order to figure out my total consumption, I would just need to go through and find the power usage for all the appliances in my home and then multiply that out in the same manner, add that all up, and that should tell you roughly what your demand is and what your outgoing cost to the utility company might be. You're probably screaming at the computer screen right now or walking around your house and looking for the watts listed on your appliances and thinking, Alone, you're crazy. There are no watts listed on my appliance. Yes, there are watts listed on a light bulb, but appliances are not exactly cut and dry like a light bulb is. And you are correct. I would love to tell you that figuring out the watts for an appliance is as simple as amps times volts, but it's a little bit more complicated than that. So the easiest thing for you to do is grab your most recent electricity bill and look at how many kilowatt hours of usage you have on that bill. That's going to tell you what your demand is, if you're going to have the same amount of appliances, lights, etc. And or you can look at that bill and then say, I'm taking about 3/4 of the amount of things that I have here, and calculate out off of that basically how much you think your usage is going to be. And that'll give you a basic idea of either your demand for solar or what your energy cost is going to be when you figure out what the energy cost is for the area in which you plan to move. I apologize that I tried to make it seem like it was really simple when it's really not. And that's why I don't like electricity, because it's not all that simple. Now, I gave you a lot of information today that you're going to have to sit down and put pen to paper and do some calculations to figure out what this is really going to cost you. And the reason I didn't give you my actual monthly expenditures is because my usage and my needs are going to be different than yours. But there's even more to cover. So next week, I'll dive into other topics about things that people might not take into consideration when they're thinking about what it's going to cost them to live in Alaska. Until then, though, be sure to watch this video here about buying land in Alaska and the things that you might want to know before you ever make an offer on a piece of land. Until next time, please stay safe and take care. And just know that I appreciate each and every one of you, from those watching to those that have subscribed and our channel members. I appreciate all of you. Take care and stay safe, and I'll see you on the next one.